In this section of training, we're going to explore consonant blends and clusters. We'll provide a summary of this topic, as well as some teacher tips on instructing students with these patterns, and do a quick pronunciation demonstration. Just for reference, if you are in the basic training, you will find the blends and clusters located in Deck 2 of the basic deck. If you are in kindergarten training, you will find the blends located within the kindergarten basic deck. Let's begin by going over the terms blend and cluster. Both blends and clusters are made up of consonant sounds. A blend has 2 consonants. A cluster has 3. The difficulty with blends and clusters is that they add complexity to words, both regarding the visual appearance of a word, which can become significantly longer, and from an articulation perspective, where producing words with so many consonants in close proximity can be difficult. When we're pronouncing blends and clusters, generally our S blends and clusters are easy to pronounce. This is because S is a continuous sound. It easily blends into the consonant that follows. When producing L blends, we want to avoid adding a schwa in front of the L, just as when we learned the pronunciation of the L sound. We want to avoid saying ul for an L blend, and instead keep the sound of the L clipped. So for the blend BL, we would not want to pronounce it as bull, which adds the schwa in front of the L, but bl, as in blue, blend, and blow. The R blend poses a similar challenge. We want to avoid saying which is reserved for the ER, IR, and UR patterns. For our R blends, instead, we want that clipped R sound of R. So, for instance, FR would not be fr. Instead, it would be fr, as in friend, fresh, and free.
Okay, so now that you have some background on blends and clusters, I want to demonstrate for you the sounds for the blends and the clusters. So I have my kindergarten blends separated from easiest to hardest. You had the background information where the S blends are a little easier to pronounce, so we'll go ahead and go through those. This one is sk. And I have new cards, sorry. Sm, sn, sp, st, and swa. So those are our kindergarten S blends. And then we move into a little bit more challenging with our L blends. Again, this L, you want to make sure you're using the first keywords to help support you with the sound. So like in block and blue, this sound would be blah. The L is a little bit of a L sound. So this one is blah, cla, fla, gla, pla, and sla. And then we're moving on into further difficulty with our R blends. For our R blends, you want to make sure that R sound is more of a R sound. So our R blends are br, cr, dra, fra, gra, pra, and tra. And then we have our lonely little tw sound. So those are our R blends for kindergarten. And then we have our most challenging, which are our ending blends, and we teach them last. So I'll go through the pronunciation of our ending blends for kindergarten. They are kt, ft, ulk, ult, and you'll notice this L is after the vowel, so it's more of the back of the throat sound. Ult, mp, and, nt, and pt. So those are the kindergarten blends that you'll be teaching that are on our lesson plans in kindergarten. So we have some other blends. You'll notice they're a different color and a different font. These are blends that are taught in first grade and up. However, as teachers, we want you to be aware of the sounds because you could be reading texts that have these sounds. And so we just have these on our sound check for you, and I want to go ahead and walk through those, these blends and clusters that are not in kindergarten. So we'll go ahead and practice those. This one is sk, skra, Shra. And notice again, even in the cluster, the R is that R sound. Spla. Again with the L before the vowel. Spla. Spra. Squa. Stra. Thra. And our only ending cluster, nch. So those will be on your sound check, just as a practice. And so that is the information and demonstration of blends and clusters.
I'd like to give you some context for how consonant blends and clusters are addressed in our OG lesson plans. In the kindergarten lessons, blends are explicitly taught one at a time. Blends that are very common or may be difficult to pronounce are often taught for 2 days in a row. First grade lessons, however, follow a slightly more aggressive pace. Instead of spending 1 day on each blend or cluster, we often group them together by common feature. For example, we may opt to teach 4 or 5 different S blends at one time, or 3 or 4 R blends together. This supports students' ability to generalize pronunciation. In second grade and up lesson plans, blends and clusters are explicitly taught in the pre-second grade lessons. They are not explicitly taught in the grade level second grade plans or in the other grade level plans. Instead, on the screen and in your manual, you'll see some options if you find yourself working with an older student and they have difficulty pronouncing, reading, or spelling these patterns. As you look at the list on the screen, notice that it progresses from least supportive to more supportive as you move down the list. Option 1 assumes that students have sufficient mastery and you would not teach blends explicitly. Again, this is the stance that is taken in lesson plans for second grade and up regarding blends and clusters. Option 2 is to focus your attention on the most problematic patterns, ending blends and initial clusters. Option 3 teaches the concept of a blend and cluster, explaining to students that they're made up of consonant patterns and that they're tightly welded together. You would then teach all the initial blends together, all the initial clusters together, and then all the final blends together. Option 4 is yet more supportive. This one mimics the procedure that we followed in the pronunciation video. This would involve teaching all the S blends as a group, then all L blends together, next the R blends together, then the initial clusters, and finally teaching the ending blends. Oftentimes, in working with blends and clusters, we must provide some additional supports for students to decode and encode words correctly. In reading word lists, we encourage students to keep the blends and clusters together. Looking at the example on your screen with the word stop, we might highlight or underline that initial blend ST and remind students to keep it together saying st as they decode the word. That is preferred over sounding those two consonants out individually. When we do that segmentation during reading, students often end up inserting a schwa between the two consonants. Instead of getting st, a, p, they get s, t, a, p, and it's harder to put that word back together. So keeping blends and clusters together during decoding is preferred. We take the opposite perspective when it comes to spelling. In spelling, we encourage pulling the blends and clusters apart. Why? Those sounds are so tightly welded together, it's often difficult for students to hear all of the consonant sounds in that pattern. As a result, they end up omitting one of those consonants when they write the word on their paper. Thinking back to our exercises for phoneme segmentation and finger spelling, we would have the students finger spell or tap out these words, pulling each of those blends and clusters apart, dedicating one finger for each of those consonant sounds. Sticking with our example, stop. If we were going to spell the word, I'd say the word stop. Students would repeat the word stop, and then we would tap it out, putting each of those sounds on one finger. Tapping it out would sound like s, t, a, p. And again, that should support students in hearing and then recording all of the consonants on their paper. This concludes our section of training on blends and clusters.